Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. So something that I really appreciate about Squarespace is that the Instagram plugin feature automatically updates on my website without me having to actually manually do it. That way, even if my main gallery hasn't been updated in a while, I like knowing that at least there's a section on my website that will always be showing my most recent work. And I also love how intuitive the design features are and that everything updates live as you're making the adjustments. And while I do find that the overall platform is very easy to use, there are great tools and posts readily available to help you out every step of the way. So if you're interested in launching your own website, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Hello friends, I hope that you've been well. If you saw my last video, you'll know that I recently received these liquid watercolors called Colorex from the brand Pebeo, and I have been having a lot of fun playing around with them. Just as a disclaimer, I was sent these for free by Pebeo, but they did not ask me to make a video or any specific content. I decided to make a video discussing and showing them off in length because I feel like I haven't seen a lot of artists using these before, and I thought it would be good to give you all my thoughts on them since it's just not something that I commonly see. So of course, as one does whenever they receive new art supplies, I started out by swatching all of the colors. I actually did this as a live stream over on my Patreon page, and it was quite fun to react and experience them live with my patrons in the chat. And because there are so many colors, the way that I decided to swatch these was by first wetting the paper with clean water. Then I used the dropper and I put the paint directly onto my paintbrush to swatch it at full strength. And then after I laid down that first pass, I followed it up with cleaning off my paintbrush and dragging the paint to create a gradient. I really like doing swatches like that because then you can get a better idea of what the color will look like with varying amounts of water. Not only the way that it looks, but also just the way that it is handling on the paper. So for those of you who happen to be new here, I am quite familiar and experienced with using panned and tubed watercolors as well as acrylic inks. However, I have never used liquid watercolors before, and let me just say, I was not prepared for how vibrant these colors were. I was really impressed with the color payoff, and I will explain in a moment as to why they are so bright. But another thing about them that I had noticed right away when I was swatching them was that the paint absorbed into the paper very quickly, much quicker than I have experienced with typical watercolors and inks. And the way that these Colorex paints sinks into the paper, particularly when it's at full strength, when it's not diluted with water, actually felt very reminiscent of alcohol markers, which I was not expecting. I also want to note that I had received a silver and a gold, and I was very impressed by how opaque these were. The gold especially was so satisfying. I only had to do one pass for both the silver and the gold, and they were fully opaque, which is something I don't think I've ever experienced before with a paint. I think all of the metallic paints and inks I've ever experienced always require at least 2 to 3 coats. So that was definitely a highlight for me. So for today's illustration, I first did my sketch in my sketchbook using an erasable colored pencil. And then from there, you see me doing a second pass with a darker color pencil to kind of finalize the sketch. Oftentimes I do my sketches digitally using my iPad because there is so much flexibility in doing that, but I will say that there is something really satisfying about sketching traditionally. I just love that tactile feel of using pencil to paper, and I really missed it because, I do a lot of sketching on my iPad, and lately a lot of my sketching studies I've been using a ballpoint pen, so it was fun to just really dive back in using a pencil. Then after the sketch is done, I busted out my light pad so that I could transfer the sketch onto some watercolor paper. And the reason why I go through this extra step is because that way when I'm in that initial sketching phase, I can sketch freely onto the sketchbook without having to worry about damaging the paper, and I can erase and redraw as many times as I want, as opposed to being really cautious about that on the actual watercolor paper. And after the sketch is transferred, I tape the watercolor paper onto a masonite board and get ready to paint. When I initially did the swatches of these Colorex paints, I didn't really do any research or really know anything about them. I just dived right in, which of course there's nothing wrong with doing that when you receive new art supplies. And honestly, I think there's a lot of benefits to it because you just sort of make all these surprising or unexpected discoveries when you kind of go into it with not knowing anything. However, after I had done the swatching and played around with them, I looked at the bottle and I noticed that, yeah, on the front, it's titled Brilliant Watercolor, and then on the back, it's listed as transparent ink. So I guess that's why I just kept calling them liquid watercolors. But then the really important thing to note, and to circle back to why they're so vibrant, is that these Colorex paints are actually dye-based. So most watercolors and inks that I'm familiar with are pigment-based, which has varying levels of light fastness, which refers to the longevity of the color. And oftentimes, really high-end paint brands like Daniel Smith will typically use pigments and select their paints based off of it having a very good light fastness so that they will last a really long time. Unfortunately, the Colorex dye-based paints are listed as limited light fastness, which means that when exposed to sunlight, they will likely discolor or fade over time. I've noticed that certain colors, particularly extremely vibrant, almost neon colors, for example, like Opera Rose from Daniel Smith, have low light fastness. So after realizing this about the Colorex, that seems to be, I guess, the trade-off with having really vibrant colors is that unfortunately they can fade over time. I, of course, have not done any actual tests on the light fastness of these paints, and I haven't really dived into actually researching a lot about it. So I have no idea when or how long it would take for them to discolor, but I'm assuming that I'm sure that they would still, last for many years before you would see anything noticeable. And that being said, it is good to be aware of these things though, because I do often sell my original illustrations. And so with these Colorex paints, knowing that they have limited light fastness, I will likely use them mainly for like casual sketchbook stuff or for works that I plan to make reproductions of in the form of prints or stickers. And then another thing is that now I know that they are dye-based, it makes so much sense as to why they reminded me of alcohol markers, since as far as I know, alcohol markers are also typically dye-based as well. So to talk a little bit more of the actual illustration here, for those of you who have been following my work on Instagram for a few years, this character that I'm painting might actually feel a little bit more familiar than usual. And for the reason for that is because I have actually painted her before. So back in 2019, I did a series called Living Fantasy, which I made my own list of prompts and, kind of within that theme. And for the subject, the princess, I painted this piece of, well, of course, a princess. And following that theme, I also had created an illustration for the prompt, the prince, as well as the knight. And I intentionally made them all have a very similar framing and look because I thought it would be fun to just, make them match and feel like they were in, like a classic shoujo love triangle trope. And then later on for the prompt, the garden, I went ahead and built my ship for the princess and knight character and illustrated them together. And I loved this illustration so much that it ended up being the cover for the zine I put together for the entire Living Fantasy series. By the way, this zine will still be available to purchase when I finally open up my shop again. I still do not have an exact date for when that will be, but I will of course let y'all know when I do. Anyways, I really loved these character designs, and after I did the garden piece, I had been thinking about revisiting them for a while, and so fast forward a few years later, I'm finally actually illustrating them again. So, like I've mentioned in the past, I am not a storyteller, or I should say, I'm not intending to make any graphic novels or stories or anything like that, but I am enjoying creating these characters and giving them at least a light world kind of around them. And as we can already tell, I'm a sucker for pink-haired characters. And the first illustration that I did of her, I put her in a purple dress, and then I had the prince character like have kind of purpley hair because I wanted them to match. And when I originally posted the illustration of the princess in this purple dress, a lot of people said that she reminded them of Princess Bubblegum from Adventure Time, which was pretty cute. But then when I created the illustration of her with the knight, I decided to give her a yellow dress, which I thought was really, really cute. I think that the yellow paired with her warm skin tone and then the warm hair color, I just really liked the very warm color palette for her, and I think it contrasted really well with the blue hair for the knight. And so, I decided I wanted to keep the yellow dress for her in this illustration, but I didn't want to necessarily pick the same dress. I love giving, my characters different outfits and clothing to wear. So I went ahead and gave her a different dress. And as soon as I put in the yellow on this dress for this illustration, it immediately transported me to that music video, Hold Up by Beyonce, where she wears that yellow dress and she has the big curly hair. And I kind of love that. It was totally accidental. I had no intentions of making that reference, but now that I have thought of it, I can't unsee it. And I'm totally here for it. Also, as a side note, painting in that background with the Payne's gray and black was extremely satisfying. When I had initially received these paints, I thought that a gray seemed redundant since you can create a gray tone just by diluting a black. But as you would have seen in the swatches at the beginning of the video, the Payne's gray has this really beautiful purple undertone to it, which I love, and totally changed my mind about the purpose and validity of having a gray watercolor. I will also say that the black actually, when you dilute it, as again you probably would have seen in the swatches, it has more of like a green undertone to it. So I thought that was very interesting, and again just proves that it is worth having both if you really like having a black and if you really like having a Payne's gray in your color palette, because they do differ from one another. And something that I continue to forget about is that the Colorex paints also has a white that I have yet to actually try. So when I did all the swatches, I just didn't bother to use the white since the paper is white. And then when I have been working on all of these illustrations so far, I just keep forgetting that I have the white. And so I haven't really experienced what that is going to be like. And I think the reason why is because when I traditionally use watercolors and inks, I never mix my colors with a white, but rather I just dilute the color with water so that the transparency of the white of the paper peeking through the paint is what I utilize to have lighter tones in the illustration. So yeah, I typically only use like a white paint marker to add little highlights at the very end of a painting. However, considering how impressively opaque the silver and gold are, and just, that Payne's gray proving me wrong, I think that I am very curious on trying the white and actually mixing it directly into the other colors. I think that it will have really interesting effects, and I look forward to experimenting more with that in the future. And then here I actually ended up deciding to opt in for some gouache. I decided that it was just going to be easier to paint the gouache on top of the paints for the flowers on the dress and the hair, as opposed to painting around all of those little elements, because it's just so finicky. And so I'm using just a bunch of dried up paint from previous illustrations, which I just re-wet with some water, and I'm throwing in some paint for the flowers on the hair and the dress. Then I also decided to add in a little bit of colored pencil to warm up the blush on her face, as well as add in some purple in some of the shadows on her skin, just for more visual interest. I don't know why, but I always perceive using colored pencils on top of watercolors to be quote unquote cheating. But in reality, that's just like a silly and unnecessary rule that I've made in my mind. There really is nothing wrong with mixed media, and I really just got to embrace the mixed media elements when the mood strikes me. I also ended up using the gouache for the line art as well, since the colors that I wanted to use were already mixed on the palette that was just leftover paint from my previous painting. So, reduce, reuse, recycle. And then here we can get that satisfying gold color in, which I added onto her tiara. And then last minute, I impulsively decided to give her gold eyeliner. And I also threw in some gold speckles kind of around her hair and her dress as well. I really like throwing in these little kind of sparkly bits. I think it really just makes for an extra special touch when you see it in different lighting situations. Unfortunately, it's not the same when you try to make it into a print, but in any case, I had to throw in some of this metallic gold because it's just so satisfying to use. So coming back to this princess character, in my mind, I have been calling her Buttercup. I think the main reason for that is because of the yellow dress, especially the previous illustration where it was that like very light, pale yellow. And when it came to me to call her Buttercup, it also got me thinking about how the princess in The Princess Bride is also named Buttercup, and I absolutely adore that movie. Obviously, that character Buttercup in that movie is very different in appearance to the Buttercup that I have created here, but I still think that's like a fun reference. That being said, how do we all feel about her being named Buttercup? Should we name her something else and Buttercup is a nickname? I don't know. I mean, I say this, but I feel like now that I've already fixated on the name Buttercup, I probably won't see her as anything else. But in any case, I would be curious to hear your thoughts on it as well. Also, a note to all of my lovely patrons, this illustration of the princess is actually going to be the postcard for the March rewards. I am almost never early on creating the artwork for the month, but for once I have done it ahead of time, and so I'm happy to reveal that this will be the reward for that month. And so for those of you who don't know, every month on my Patreon page, I pick a theme, and within that theme, I create an illustration for a postcard print and a sticker design that I mail out every month. And if you happen to be interested in receiving this particular illustration as a print, if you sign up anytime during the month of March, you will have her and a sticker mailed to you in the month of April. You also have access to all of my exclusive videos, sketchbook pages, and other bonus content that I only post on Patreon. And so I really love doing little series. And so for the month of April, the theme will be the night. And I, of course, will be revisiting the night character to correspond with our princess here. I also have yet to name the knight either, so maybe in a future video I can show off the process of creating the new illustration of her, and then maybe we can brainstorm some names. I also have not decided yet if I want to revisit the prince character as well. Let me know if y'all are interested in seeing the true love triangle come to fruition. Anyways, that brings us to the end of today's video. I hope that you enjoyed seeing me work on this illustration of Buttercup and hearing my thoughts on these liquid watercolors by Pebeo. And thank you so much for watching. I hope that you have an amazing day or evening wherever you're at, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!